Bear with me. Okay, so hopefully you should be able to see some slides now. So thanks, Steve, for that introduction. Yes, I'm Jenny or Jen. I might be on the community if you're looking for me. Thanks so much for everyone coming along today. It's great to see quite a few people interested in this topic. So I'll just talk quickly a little bit about what we're going to go through. I'm going to talk a little about the definition of accessibility, both in terms of physical accessibility and also digital accessibility, which is going to be more relevant to us. Also going to talk a little bit about my own experiences with digital accessibility. We're going to look at using web accessibility as inspiration for what we do in data visualization, and just a little bit of kind of generalized what else can we do kind of in this subject area. Full transparency, I am not an accessibility expert. As Steve says, I've got some of my own lived experiences. And what I'm reflecting on here today is what I've learned from other people, what I've put together as well. And it's aimed at being kind of a very high level introduction to accessibility. It's still a growing area that I think a lot of people are starting to either just initially hear about or start to develop their knowledge of as well. So I'm aiming very much to give you some thinking and possibly talking points here, but ultimately the level of detail you need in accessibility is quite extensive. That said, please do ask questions on anything that comes up. And with that, I will crack on into accessibility as a whole. So accessibility is a practice of making information, activities, and or environments sensible, meaningful, and usable for as many people as possible. And that's a very important distinction, the as many people as possible there. We often think accessibility is something that applies to a very specific set of disabilities. But ultimately, and we'll come on to this, there are ways that you can make information, activities, what have you, inaccessible to other people. So it's important to imagine as wide an audience as possible when you're thinking about accessibility. To give you some examples that are maybe more familiar, when we think about physical accessibility, you've probably seen ramps into buildings, accessible toilet facilities, you may have seen it in large print documents, subtitles on TV and films, those kind of things. When it comes to digital accessibility, some of the kind of tools or adjustments you might see, people might use things like screen readers. They might control their apps, their computers, whatever, with voice control. Color contrast standards, for those of you who are already in the visualization community might already be aware of things about how we use color in our presentations. And also elements like screen navigation. Not everybody uses a mouse to navigate a screen. Some people might use a keyboard, and these are all factors in how we make our information accessible. Sorry, skipped the wrong way. Adding on to that, there is somewhat a concept of situational accessibility. So it can be that you can exist through your entire life and never have an accessibility issue until a certain point. It only happens in a certain way. So we have to think about things like different devices. There's a million different smartphones, laptops, tablets, and digital information will present differently on each of those devices. If you create something like, let's say, works on a laptop and doesn't work on a phone, someone who primarily uses a phone to access that information, you've kind of made it a bit inaccessible for them. Also thinking about changing abilities due to age or illness. Just it might be at times that, like, as we grow older, things like our vision changes. So from one week to the next, and I had this as I approached the age of 45, my vision changed that I started to not being able to see something that I'd been able to see the week before. Situational limitations. I've got a specific kind of example of this is I'm sure we're all in various chat groups with our friends, and I have a friend who works in the theatre. So two of us were chatting away in our little chat group, but we were sending voice notes because we think we're hysterical. So we kept sending these voice notes being super, super funny. And ultimately our third friend who works in the theatre just messaged, said, I can't listen to any of these. I'm in a rehearsal. Now, it was a jokey situation, but ultimately we had made that inaccessible for her. If that had been something important, our choice of communication had made it inaccessible to her, but not permanently. At the end of the day, she got to read through all of them or listen to all of them, and she thought it was hysterical. And then finally, just another factor that I think we're probably all more aware of from the past couple of years, things like slow internet connection, poor bandwidth. You can't access something. It doesn't maybe happen all the time, or it might be locational. This can also make digital information inaccessible to you. So that's the rough kind of high level of accessibility as a whole. So moving on to my own experience with accessibility, and I'm too quick with the clicker there. disability and neurodivergence is strong in my family. My mum, who I think is now about 78, over the past couple of years, has run into a number of visual impairments. Every time we think we've fixed one, we find another one. So the last couple of years has been like a panicked experience of trying to find ways for her to be able to see data. One of my favorite examples was she couldn't read her bank statements, which she still gets by paper. She's adorable. And when I looked at the alternative options for a bank statement, the particular bank said, oh, we can send it on CD. Now, for a 78-year-old woman who doesn't have access to the internet and has a visual impairment, I don't imagine poking the buttons on a CD player to have it read out to her is actually that much more accessible. So I've had experience with that. Also, I have a now fully grown sized daughter who has both dyslexia and ADHD. So that was 10 years of thinking, why can't you do your homework, or why are you terrible at exams, until someone explained all of that to us, because she was not diagnosed at a young age. And finally, my own experience is I have ADHD. I'm, again, a late diagnosee, a kind of person that annoys Piers Morgan, I imagine. I'm happy to be on the right side of that argument. And once I got my diagnosis for ADHD, some of the experiences I've had with digital information in the wider world started to make a little bit more sense. So I wanted to use those as a little bit of context for how it impacts maybe not one of the more obvious kind of conditions as well. So what does my ADHD do? I'm going to talk at this in terms of executive functions. These are the building blocks of how we make decisions, how we behave, how we respond to things. And I do a separate gig in executive function if anyone wants to ask me about that. But things like I have a lousy working memory. So my ability to hold information while performing complex tasks is terrible. I can't follow instructions in any way. Delights my husband no end. And also that ability to recall from past experiences. So like in a Tableau context, we'll go on to Tableau as well. I can do certain things. I always need the instructions to do them because I'm never going to be able to recall how I followed a certain set of steps. So I have lousy working memory. Goal-directed persistence, this is another element with ADHD, working towards and following through the completion of a goal while ignoring distractions, very difficult for me. And sustained attention, nope, absolutely not. The classic ADHD symptom, maintaining attention regardless of distractibility, fatigue, or boredom. So how do these challenges translate to an accessibility kind of question? Let's think about, I'm using some websites here to illustrate this best. So Stack Overflow, again, a lot of you might be familiar with this. When I go and Google a question, how do I do X, Y, Z? Stack Overflow is usually one of the first resources that comes up. Now, I'm sure it's an absolutely lovely website. For me, when I look at this, you can see there's information in this yellow box here, so that distracts me. There's an advert here, that distracts me. There's other stuff happening here, and possibly somewhere in here is the answer to the question I'm looking for. I find it very difficult to be able to focus or find my answers. So in general, if I Google something and Stack Overflow comes up, I don't use it as a resource because I just can't focus. I can't pull the information easily out of what's in front of me. Moving on to a slightly better example, and this is the Tableau knowledge base. I'm a feral Tableau developer. I'm trying to expand my skills, but a lot of my stuff comes from Tableau. This is much better for me. It's a much cleaner experience. It's kind of got obvious headings. I wouldn't say their font is ideal because it is a serif font, but it's a lot clearer and there are points that are easier for me to follow. There's a little bit of stuff to the right here that kind of might be a bit distracting, but it also might be, it feels it's more obvious where it says related links that maybe I need to click one of those links to answer a question as well. Coming on to what is ironically not where I thought I would find a good example of digital accessibility. The Zara clothing website. Now, if you go onto Zara, there's a little icon that's the accessibility icon, and you click on that, and Zara brings up all of these options for tools that can help you with accessibility. And there is an ADHD specific one. So if you click on that, there's a great like a focus bar that can come up. You can underline paragraphs of text or sentences of text as well. And as you can see, there's a huge selection and they're interchangeable because there can be an overlap with these things, that a tool that's useful for someone with color blindness might actually be useful for someone with ADHD. And it's built into the website. There are, separate to all of these kind of things, there is accessibility software where a lot of these kind of tools exist within a tool that stand alone. Now, if you don't have that tool, you might have to install it, or you might have to pay for it in some way. Having the accessibility built into the website can just make it a little bit easier to do. So if I was using Zara, I'm delighted by the fact that I can use some of these things to focus on the area I want, although I'm usually just looking at the pictures of girls sitting on a cooker to highlight a jacket or something at Zara. So that's kind of some of my experiences, things I noticed with websites. And using that is a little bit around how we can use it as inspiration for data visualization, because currently there's no guidelines for data visualization specifically. So if there's any web developers, design type people in the room, you will know about WCAG. Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, the least accessible sentence to say repeatedly or at speed. But these are international guidelines that are kind of specific to web content, but we can use them for data visualization. And in general, and this is based very much for people in the UK, there are requirements in the Equality Act and the Public Sector Bodies Act around how accessible your content is. And WCAG is one of the ways that if you are adhering to those guidelines, the chances are that your content is accessible. If you actually go and look at the WCAG website, it is huge. It's all there for web developers at a great level of detail. And if that's your vibe, I definitely would recommend going to look at it. I have no attention span, it's not my vibe. But the high level thing that comes from WCAG is these four principles that can help us guiding kind of the direction we go. So content should be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So if you think about those four areas, is my visualization, whatever we're doing, is it meeting those kind of principles, then I'm on the right track. But we will just go through them in a little bit more detail. So perceivable, information and user interface components must be presentable to users in ways they can perceive. And let's go through a couple of sub-points of that heading. So when we think about how we perceive information, there can be an instant response, particularly in a room of visualizers, that it is only visually perceived. But bear in mind, we use hearing to perceive information, and we also use touch. From a visualization lens, we'll come and we'll talk about screen readers and those kind of things. It's thinking about, yes, we are very much visualizers, dependent on a visual medium, but how do we address how people can perceive that information through other avenues, such as hearing and touch? I've not seen vibrating dashboards yet in any way. I don't know how you would have a touch type thing, but it's an area to consider, is if I close my eyes, how can I perceive a visualization? Which brings on, for me, a slightly difficult question when you're talking about visualization. Does it always need to be visual? So something to think about here in a kind of roundabout way is how people are using your visualization. Now, if it's in a presentation way, so if I was sat here going through a series of charts, I would be talking and someone can get more information from me speaking as well as looking at it. If you're maybe using something that's like Tableau server where you're publishing information, is there a way you can enhance that information as well as what is just being visual? I've done examples of these kind of things, not to necessarily say they work, but as examples of even just sending emails where I've sent the email and then I've sent a voice recording of what I am saying in the email to some people who all had different accessibility needs to see if it was any kind of help to them. So although, yes, we are visualizers, can we change the concept of how we make things visual to people? Thinking next about screen readers. Now, I'll go into this, and yeah, there's a bit more detail in here. So if you aren't familiar with screen readers, it does exactly what it says on the tin. It is a piece of software that will read out exactly what is on the screen. Now, it isn't just a case of if I put a screen reader over this slide, it wouldn't just read out the words you see. It will do things like describe the window. It will describe menu buttons and all of these kind of things. What I discovered from working with Tableau, and again, dependent on your visualization weapon of choice, it's something to go and investigate, is there are elements of Tableau tools that are not screen reader friendly. So in a Tableau visualization, it will be able to read, a screen reader can read titles, captions, text, those kind of things. It can't read a bar chart to anybody. So that's depending on your tool, there will be alternatives as to how you make the visualization screen reader friendly as well. Finally, coming to colour vision deficiency and colour contrast, and actually meant to add in here light sensitivity. This could be a whole presentation by itself. I think the level of detail I found and I've spoken to people about with this. So colour vision deficiency, also known as colour blindness, is people will be able to perceive differences in colour differently. So I can perceive the difference between red and green in quite an obvious way. Colour vision deficiency or colour blindness impacts the way in you which perceive the difference in those colours as well. There's also kind of concepts around colour contrast. So how many, a ratio of difference between one colour and the colour that is next to it. There's a ratio for if you're just using colour for black background, and also a ratio for if you're using colour against your text against your colour. If you Google colour contrast tools, there are a million tools that will help you with that, because it can be complete combinations that you wouldn't actually think work very well together. But these are things to think about, and I will go through a couple more examples. And just to touch on light sensitivity, is something someone asked me about at a previous chat in terms of like dark and light mode backgrounds. Some people will be able to perceive and understand information better on a dark background versus some on a white background. So that's something to think about. Again, some tools will have light and dark backgrounds innately built in, or if you're building your visualization in like what I call hard coding languages, it will be a lot easier to configure light and dark mode options there. So just something to think about, as say this whole part could be a session by itself. What I've done, I've put together a couple of examples of actual visualizations, because that's what we're talking about, to talk through some of those differences as well. Now, these are not high quality visualizations. These are done by me, not to show off my visualization skills, but to highlight some of the concepts. Someone once suggested to me that you should always, if you're doing things that aren't work related, you should visualize something you love. So I've tried to visualize my Starbucks habits over the past couple of years to talk a little bit about color and color contrast. So in a very straightforward graph, I got from my bank statement how much I spent on Starbucks in the last 5 years, picked a very simple question. Spending more than £50 a year on Starbucks is potentially considered questionable. Show me when that happened. And I did a very straightforward, there is red bars for every time I've gone over 50 quid. Glorious to look at. As you can see, 2022 was a tough year. Also, in my defense, a Starbucks didn't open till nearer in 2021. But this is fairly obvious to me. Red bad, green good, we all know these kind of things. Someone with colour vision deficiency will not see a contrast between these two bars in any way. So options you can do is things like adding in text, or I'm unsure which is better here, data labels directly linked to, say, your bar chart. So you would say, you'd put a label above the green one saying, hey, this is good in some way. Because I think legends apparently can be a bit different for perceiving not only the color, but how the text connects to the boxes. But you could use something like text as well as color to enhance the experience you're trying to get. You could also use completely different colors. You don't have to use, in a very specific situation, red or green. So Tab had some of its own kind of his a colorblind palette, and I think Power BI actually has the same as well in its themes. There are suggested palettes where if you've picked red and green and you pick another palette, your tool will change it for you. So I just use different colors here to indicate differences between kind of different values in answer to the question. I did also put in a reference line. I've left it here and I actually hate it. I do not enjoy this as a solution, but it might work for other people. So the point I'm trying to make here is where we use color as a big part of our storytelling and our visualization experiences, are there things we can enhance, because some people will prefer color to show them that difference. Can we enhance, and can we layer other kind of tools on top of it to make it easier for the people who don't see color quite as much? Coming up next then, that's everything around kind of perceivable, how we make or some key points around how we make our stuff perceivable. Moving on now then to operable. So user interface components and navigation must be operable. What are we talking about here? Thinking about things like keyboard focus. So if you don't use a mouse, if you don't use a mouse, I'm just going to pause a second, guys, because my computer is giving me a horrible message. and I just want to be able to get rid of it. Beautiful. Fine, that's better. It's no longer distracting me. Sorry about that. So yeah, keyboard focus. Not everyone uses a mouse to navigate navigate their computers. Some of the hard code boys will absolutely only use hotkeys. Keyboard focus is this concept of if someone uses a tab button to move between items on a screen, they should operate in a logical order. So in general, left to right, top to bottom, those kind of things. In some tools where you're building dashboards or collections of data, you want to make sure that however that happens and test it is if you tab between objects in a dashboard, for example, that follows a natural order, that it doesn't jump from, you know, top left to bottom right. And it's, again, it's just thinking about somebody's interacting with your visualization in a different way. Does it work in that different way? Links, interactions, do they work, and are they descriptive or obvious enough? So I discovered this through the joys of the click here movement. Click here is something that some of us may see a lot in things like emails or on web pages. It is a lousy way to ask people to click. It's not descriptive. It doesn't tell them what's going to happen and all these kind of things. So if you are having interactive dashboards that maybe click and link to URLs that go off somewhere else or that go to another visualization, it's making sure it's very obvious that there is an interaction there to be had, that it's operable by keyboard as well as by mouse, and that people know exactly where it's going and what happens to them when they do it. And I think equally there's a point about what happens if it doesn't work. I've seen instances of kind of like where there is a context of a back button, go back the way, and a revert button. Revert resets a load of values, back just goes back the way. So if you click off on a link and you want to come back to where you were before the link, is there a clear user pathway for that in your visualizations? Filters and parameters are great, but do they make the experience more complex? This is aimed at me. Love an interactive dashboard, love filters and parameters for ways of giving people options and variety of how they drill into the data. But if we don't create a decent user journey with those things, and again, thinking about tabbing and using return or interacting via keyboard, sometimes filters and parameter type functions and slices in Power BI are actually going to make the experience less operable for somebody. So it's just thinking about, do I really need filters, and do they really do something that makes it easy to move between different views of the data? Finally, operable speech recognition software. If there is anyone in the call who's watching a recording, I would love to talk to somebody about the actual experience of how speech recognition software works with some of the visualization tools and some of the coding tools as well. So some people are going to use speech to interact, to operate our visualizations, and we need to think about how that actually works and be cognizant of it, and do we need to test it? But unlike the vision stuff, it's an area I'm not particularly familiar with, but it's just, as I say, something to be thought about in terms of our interactions, our visualizations operable. Moving on to our next principle then is they have to be understandable. Information and the operation of the user interface must be understandable. And this for me is actually kind of, context exists already in visualization for this. Anyone familiar with data storytelling principles? They are really helpful. We probably do them without thinking about them as being accessible, but they are making information more usable. So for example, using text titles to describe what's happening in a visualization. If you think you come back to a screen reader can't read that bar chart for you, but it can read that text at the top of the bar chart and describe that visualization. So if you can go away and up your data storytelling skills, not only are you making more impactful and more powerful visualizations, you're probably making them more accessible at the same time. Tables as well as charts, put a heavy sigh in here. Certainly when I started out in visualization, tables were the devil's work. Everything was supposed to be a pretty picture, and we all know about the general hatred of, can I download it to Excel? Depending on the context, if you have an aggregated summary of a large data set, so you might have a bar chart at the top, it might be beneficial to have a summary, again, numeric summary of those numbers if the context makes sense as well, because it's just going to be easier to digest for some people. If you're showing 20,000 rows of data somehow in a visualization, absolutely don't put 20,000 rows of data next to it. It makes it look awfully busy and it will not serve the purpose that you think it will. But it's just, again, moving away from some of our more traditional understandings of visualization being charts. Table is still visualizing the data. Can we use it to help people who maybe don't like the charts as much? Next up, reducing interpretation. And this is a difficult one. I think there'll be some great conversations around this in like the wider visualization community, and definitely if you can add it into the Data Lab community, it would help. We automatically go, there is we've done a bar chart and this bar is bigger than this bar next to it. What are we doing to say whether that is good or bad? So we talked about color. You might make that bar red to go bigger is worse, like we've lost more money, but it might be that we've got more visitors, so that should be green and those kind of things. And this is a completely wide open question of how much do you feed into your visualizations to make it really obvious, and how much can you make it that people aren't having to think as much about, is that good or bad? What is that visualization telling me? Beautiful. So we talked about interpretation, and moving on to a final point about data being understandable. This is very much a me problem, Sankey chart related rage. So I recently saw this as an example. It's a new feature Tab have done. I assume it exists in other parts of the visualization world around a Sankey chart. And I think for me, this is similar to the great pie chart debate of using the wrong visualization for the wrong thing. So a Sankey chart, as I understand it, because someone explained it to me last time I had a meltdown about it, is there to reflect a journey in some way. So the data that's been used in this, a location, technology, like sales dimensions, all of these kind of things, the context for me, this Sankey chart makes absolutely no sense. It might be technically correct, the data might be correct, but I don't understand it. And certainly for my brain, I'm not going to look at it for very long. There will be other ways that we all do this. We all use visualization where we've gone for something that might be very aesthetic and exciting and all of those kind of things, but we're missing the point of the message that we are trying to deliver in some way. That's not to say if anyone ever gives me a Sankey chart, I will continue to have meltdowns about it, but just to think about, and again, I think people are already doing this in their visualizations, is thinking about the visual element. Is it the right kind of visual tool to tell the story that we want to tell? And next up, robust, which is like quite awkward now. I've had this total train wreck, but content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted reliably by a wide variety of user agents, including assistive technologies as well. So touched on this a little bit at the start. Does your visualization work on all devices, mobile, laptop, and tablet, in terms of sizing? Even if you think about scrolling as if you take something and put it onto your little phone and there's a lot of this, how does that then impact the experience? Is even for people who don't have an accessibility issue, does it make it just more difficult to use and understand? So when you're building something, and depending who and where you're sharing these things, think about, is it going to work on all the devices I expect it to need to work on? Error handling. If something goes wrong, and this is as much kind of good practice as it is an accessibility requirement, have you put, and I think this is a requirement for websites, like a contact name on your visualization. Now, if you're sharing something to 5 guys in your team and they know it's you, that's not as much of a requirement. If you're publishing something onto a website that could go to thousands, millions of people, if something doesn't work on it, are they able to get to the person who made it, you, quite easily? So thinking about having something that says, if you have a problem, you can contact XYZ person. Also context dependent, things like an alternative link to the data source. So you've done your analysis and you've created a view of this data, which then doesn't work. If you can then provide the data packaged behind what you've produced in some way, some people will then be able to go and do their own thing with it. So if they don't find your visualization something they can use, you've not completely restricted them from that story. They can still go and do their own things with it as well. Assistive technology, so I touched on things like speech recognition and screen readers and those kind of things. I did try using the screen reader at one point, and I think due to bandwidth and ancient technology, when I tried to run it on things, it just started to churn away in the background. And again, person of short patience and attention span, I couldn't actually cope with that delay. So depending on what you're kind of delivering, is if you've already got a dashboard that, let's say, churns a little bit because it's going through like a big query or something like that, if you then maybe layer something else on top of it, like assistive technology, is that going to slow the whole thing down in some way? And again, there will be like free versions of assistive technology you can use to test that yourself. But again, just to think about, maybe performance at one level is fine. If you add anything into that, does that still have the same performance? Beautiful. So that's the kind of 4 principles from the WCAG, but there are other things we can think about, other things we can do. So the one thing I'll say about all this, perfection is difficult to achieve, and this is true of absolutely everything in life, but at least we can start to think about it, talk about it, and show it in some way. So you've all showed up for this, hopefully, fingers crossed, you've learned something about accessibility, and I'm quite a chaotic person. But you've got hopefully now some inspiration and things you didn't necessarily think of before. There's no gotcha, there's no we're all terrible people, you don't know what you don't know, but now you've attended this, you can start to educate yourself, and there's a lot of great resources, and I will try and share some more in the community as well. Depending on where you are, accessibility consultants and testers do exist. You can pay a guy to come test things for you, but they are not cheap. So it entirely depends on context, but that does exist, as there are accessibility experts in the world. User interviews. Again, if you're working on producing visualizations that are going to wide audiences, and even if it is just a guy that sits next to you at a desk, build that concept of accessibility into the conversations you have. So not just asking, what's the data story you want to tell? How many, do you want to see sales? Do you want to see profit? It's asking a question kind of like, how can I make this accessible to you? You're not going to ask specific things. They might volunteer it, but it's making that how people interact and how they perceive that data part of those user interviews and part of that design process as well. A final tip that I got from working from a very large organization is brand guidelines. And this is one way to kind of make things easier from that color perspective in some way. I had this kind of swap of a massive art marketing team. They had picked all of the colors for visualization, for backgrounds, for presentation, for every piece of kind of content that company produced. So I never had to think about the color contrast. I just used what they gave me. So if you're in a big organization, someone will have thought of this and you should be able to use it in some way. But if you don't, you can still work out standard format and a color scheme for yourself, even if it's for your own personal use. If you're building your own portfolio, do that work on what color contrasts work well, is it CVD friendly, and those kind of things, and then apply that to every visualization you do. One, it looks very powerful as you go through a portfolio, that there's kind of a clean lines and that clean look, everything looks the same, but also you're making it accessible. Do it within your own small groups, you and 5 guys in your team, sit down together and work out what works for everybody. I had one example, a chat with someone, just coming back to like light sensitivity, where 2 people actually genuinely sat next to each other. One needed a yellow background. There are certain forms of dyslexia where you can process information better with a yellow background, and the guy needed a dark background, and they just kind of bickered and argued for days on end about what was the right background. They ended up with a technical solution, which was 2 of the same dashboard, so that they could each meet their requirements. But the point was, once they started talking about it and worked out what would work for both of them, and it needed to be 2 different things. So although you may not have a brand, you may not work for a company, you may just be visualizing at home, start to think about inventing your own brand, not just because it looks really good, but because you can help improve the accessibility. That's kind of everything. Let's just do a run through before we go to if there are any questions. What have we hopefully learned today? Concept of accessibility. It goes beyond disabilities, and remember that it's making it accessible for as many people as possible. You've learned about my accessibility experiences, so you can use your own experiences, but also learn from others. So some of you may already know that you have accessibility needs and start to use that to inform the fact that when you need something, someone else might need something different, but start to learn from people around you as well. And it can even be as simple as color preference. I prefer this to this. It doesn't necessarily make it accessible or not accessible, but those are conversations you're probably already having. Making them about accessibility is not going to be a huge step forward. Web accessibility. Somebody asked me in one of these sessions if there was any materials. I've yet to find the dictionary to accessibility and data visualization. So I'm using web accessibility, as we've touched on, as that kind of inspiration. So if you're unsure about something you're doing, go and see what you would do if it was on a website. The chances are that's what you want to think about in your visualizations. And remember those 4 principles: perceivable, operable, usable, and robust. And the one thing I would say is there is no single answer to solving specific problems. I touched on it before, like trying not to use red and green to highlight something. There was 5 different solutions already in my tiny brain for that. The Data Lab community absolutely would be a great place to do that. So we've got that visualization group. There's also a neurodiverse group. We're all pretty familiar with similar things. So there's plenty of groups within the community where if you're not sure, someone else may have already done it, someone else may have an answer, or you'll get the benefit of just talking about it in some way. So don't sit staring at your desk thinking, I'm doing it all wrong, I don't know what to do. Loads and loads of happy smiley voices hopefully out there to help you. And that is everything from me. I can see we've got a couple of questions coming up in the Q&A. So Steve, I'll let you come and supervise me like the adult you are.
Thanks very much, Jenny. That was really interesting, and it's interesting that you mentioned that kind of one of your kind of your top examples of kind of web accessibility comes from one of the least expected places. But yeah, so we've got a few questions in the chat coming through. The first one that's come through is from Kevin Flanagan, and he's asked, I'm interested in your point of view about cognitive perception as opposed to age, physiological, disability influenced perceptions of visualizations. For example, the impacts of poor mental health on perception and how it affects perception.
Brilliant. That's a superb question. Thank you very much for that. So, one of the things I'm going to just touch on something else that I have learning in, it might seem circular, bear with me, Kevin, is if I go back to that concept of executive function, this way that we all learn how we behave, how we make decisions. Executive functions are very much talked about now currently as something that impact neurodiverse people, but they impact everybody. They're impacted by stress, they're impacted by trauma, they're impacted by neurodivergence, even impacted by environment as well. So you can have, as we touched on, temporary issues so that it isn't that you get older, but things like when you're stressed, if you've got poor mental health, if you've got a big busy ass visualization and there's flashing lights and shit everywhere, when you're stressed, you're already in your foxhole. So there is definitely an element that says it's not just necessarily some of the obvious things we think about affect our perception. It is those temporary factors, and they can be longer term factors as well. So I think you're absolutely, the question, which I don't know if I've answered correctly, but I think you're absolutely right, is there are different elements to what affects our cognitive perception, for sure. If I didn't answer any of that right, just shout or ask a second question. Follow-ups are fine.
Thank you. And we've got another one from Catherine, who's asking, is it better to produce a separate accessible version of a visualization rather than overly clutter the original version? So would it be kind of different versions for different needs, I guess?
Oh, yes and no, which is a thoroughly unhelpful answer. Is if I put my incredibly cynical head on, why are you doing twice the work? So I've talked about somebody did have to duplicate dashboards. I would say make the accessible version also the most impactful version in some way. And it can be, and I see a lot with kind of something like what I call competitive visualization stuff as well, is that aesthetics are taking over a lot, and a lot of those are not going to be accessible. So I would want to see something that kind of does both, which is really not helpful maybe if you're like, I've got no time. I would say simplify what you've got, go with the less cluttered one. And again, make it engaging, that if people want to ask more of your visualization, give them that opportunity to do that, because you'll have some people that will, as we're have follow-up questions and those kind of things. So I would always ask that we try and make things as accessible as possible, and then layer in ways for people with different asks and different experiences that want to get involved. Maybe find ways, because if you do 2 versions and only one person cares about the more aesthetic version, you've wasted your time there a little bit. And sorry, again, that's a slightly circular, timey-wimey answer.
Not at
I would
all.
say make it accessible. That's the short answer.
Accessible first.
Yes.
So we've got this one. This question doesn't have a name. It's come from someone anonymous, but they're asking, have you ever come across a visualization where consideration for accessibility has been taken to an extreme that ended up not being accessible?
I probably have in some way, and I think I've probably produced some myself. So I used to do a lot of kind of like short POC builds. I was never about making perfect visualizations, but I think certainly have kind of dialed down the impact to make something more accessible. One of the things I just thought I had this somewhere in my notes is visualization is in itself making data more accessible. If we're taking complicated data concepts and making them easier for the average Joe to understand in some way, we are making it more accessible. If you then find that you're simplifying it so much, and it's like going from having like a dashboard to having like 20 different graphs because you thought that was more accessible, I can absolutely see that happening. So it's a case going, definitely we are, by making it visual, we are making it easier to perceive, but also let's not dumb it down so much that people don't understand the data back in the first place because we've made it too simple.
Thank you. So Naomi's asking, I was wondering if there's anything that should never be done. For example, high contrast stripes can be very visually disturbing for interiors.
There will absolutely be a list of things that will never be done, and I think you will find it will be in the color spectrum of it. Is definitely, like, I've seen, and this, I think it wasn't even in a visualization, it was in a bloody spreadsheet. Someone had put green and purple in a spreadsheet, and I've just realized your colors are green and purple. That's fine in that context. Don't do green boxes with purple text on them. That would where I'd be kind of, there will be hard and fast rules, I think, more likely around color, of just making things so that even to the casual observer, they're not perceivable in any way as well.
I believe you have posted a few examples of color combinations in the community.
Yes, there's a couple of great tools, and again, because I'm feral Tableau girl, they do come from the Tableau community. If other people have other tools with good examples of kind of, you can put in, if you've got a color you really like, you put in the hex code, there are tools that will give you your palette, which says that's your one color here, these 5 other colors will all work well and will all contrast. So although color is likely the spot that has the most kind of, you could really screw someone up, I feel like it's the area that's got the most options and solutions available. So yeah, if you have a look at that data visualization group, and someone posted a really scientific one, I forget the gentleman's name, I did credit him in the post, a brilliant kind of scientific analysis of how you should use color as well. So definitely check those out.
Yeah, a little plug for anybody who's not joined yet to sign up.
Yeah.
So we've got time for, we've got another 10 minutes, so we've got time for a few more questions, and they do seem to be coming in pretty thick and fast at the moment. So we've got one from Tanushri, who's asking, what are your thoughts on the use of embedded links? For example, learn about X, Y, and Z by following the instructions, where the link is embedded in the words, follow the instructions, versus learn about X, Y, and Z by following the instructions, view it here, and then the link is viewed, the link is in the view it here text.
So this, I think, where it becomes important is how, there's a couple of different ways it becomes important. There is an element where screen readers, if you have like a hyperlink, I think is what you're referring to. If you have a hyperlink, so you have Jen and then the link attached to it, a screen reader will read the text of the hyperlink out. So to me, who doesn't use a screen reader now, I will just see the word, but a screen reader user will see what's in the hyperlink. So it is fine in that way, is that screen readers will be able to see it. if you were to just put like a long sentence that says learn about X, Y, Z here, and then you have the whole link, there's nothing wrong with that as well. Apart from when it comes back to whoever asked a question about cluttering, is that can feel a little bit over busy. So I have a real problem with academic papers with references in. The moment someone puts like the Harvard reference in, it's got I can't read the sentence because I'm like, what the hell are these words? And I think for me personally, having a full link or more data in a sentence would be more difficult. I think check out hyperlinks and screen readers. There'll be a human on the internet explain it better than me. I think you're better to have more of the information hidden away and have the sentence clearer, and the screen reader hopefully will do the rest of the work for you.
Brilliant, thanks. I've got something from Joanna saying, brilliant, thanks so much, I learned a lot. She's wondering about the Tableau versus our Shiny. They're moving more towards using Shiny dashboards, which allow a few accessibility features, but it's tricky with interactive charts as they're very much dependent on filters. So one alt text isn't enough. They've included tables. Any thoughts on that? On our Shiny versus Tableau in terms of accessibility?
Cool. I'm just reading that question. Yeah, okay. I'm not as familiar with our Shiny. I did have a to-do list thing that I need to learn about more of the other things apart from drag and drop type things. And alt text is a really good point. Actually, you can use, if you use an image of your visualization, yes, you can apply alt text to it. Without knowing our Shiny in detail, I think it comes back to clutter versus not clutter and oversimplifying things. Is if your filter, let's say your filter is to filter like 4 different values, you might be better with having 4 visualizations of those different dashboards and a more simplified way to navigate them rather than having the drop down. But I appreciate filters can be there, that they are there for, 20 odd values. So I think it's a difficult one without the full context. I think if you can simplify it to reduce the interactivity without losing the detail, then absolutely do that. But as I've said, things are not necessarily perfect. Even if you kind of put like a text box at the bottom, do the best you can. If you can put a text box in our Shiny that says, if you have any issues with our filters, please do give us a shout and we'll do something else, and make sure that people know if they are having a struggle that they can just come and ask you and you work it out for their specific use case as well. That's maybe some suggestions I'd give.
Thank you. Warren's asking, maybe you'll know the answer to this. What does the UK Disability Discrimination Act require in terms of reasonable adjustment on data visualizations for the sensory impaired?
I think, unless you know, and this is a trick question, I don't think a lot of these acts are specific and it says you must do X, Y, Z. So when I looked at the Equality Act stuff, that kind of, I think my understanding is referred to WCAG and having to stick with that. So yeah, and this is one of these areas where I'm going to go away, and I've done this so someone's asked you a question, educate myself more about your question. My understanding of anything that refers to reasonable adjustments is the reasonable adjustment is never dictated in any way. It says if you've got X, Y, Z, then you have to do a reasonable adjustment. It doesn't say what those reasonable adjustments are. If anyone, or if you'd warn, if you do have specific examples you've seen of things where it says it has to do this, let me know, share them in the community and all those kind of things. These are the kind of the specifics it'd be great to get into. Thank you for that question.
And on that, Kevin's asking if we can get your contact details. So I think the answer to that is join the community and continue the conversation in there.
Absolutely, yeah. Steve's only going to point you that way. I'll cough and say it sounds like inked bin. I'm Jen Gates 14. You can get me on there as well. This is where Steve magically cuts the call off. If you're not,
no, not at all, not at all.
You can get me on LinkedIn as well, Kevin.
Yeah. So we've maybe got time for one more, depending on how long the question is. So let's see what we got. There's a lot of dogmatism in visualization work, so plenty of people endorse it, example Tufts principles, and find it very hard to compromise on those when accessibility is at stake.
Yeah.
What would you say to them, and what's the killer argument to change their mind?
How would you feel if your elderly mother couldn't do something? That's how I started to understand this and how I started to understand it for myself, and I absolutely get it. I've had I had a flash versus substance fight over iron vises and all of these kind of things, and it is absolutely there. There is a time and a place for the beautiful and the aesthetic that your elderly mother will not care about whether she uses it. If you are in an environment where you know you've got that regular Joe, average Joe at the end of it, as if it's your mother, and this is exactly what happened to me. My mother was in tears because she didn't know if she was overdrawn. Think about your visualization having that kind of impact on somebody, and that might make you think about making it a bit more accessible over the aesthetic. That's quite a militant answer. I apologize for ending on a downer, but that's the only way, is that I made the connection with it, was when it became real and relatable for me.
Brilliant, thank you. And then the last question that we'll get to before we call it a day. Someone's asking if there's any chance we can have a share of your slides.
Absolutely.
Happy to share those.
Yeah, more than happy to share those, and I have no problem if people want to use them, as long as you credit where you got them from. Not that I'll know. Equally, obviously, there's in the community, if you want me to come and talk to people in your organizations, I've done this for some of the user groups for Tableau. I'm happy to do it for other tools. Although I've touched on Tableau here, the principles are the same in some way. So happy to share for the slides, and if anyone wants to come talk to me directly or have other sessions, then please do that as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, as Jenny said, if you want to keep in touch, find Jenny on LinkedIn and connect. We've got one last comment here. There's not a question, but just saying thank you for your presentation. Their organisation is looking to create an academy to train IT software testers to perform accessibility testing.
Boom,
So,
like that. Just another comment, I know you're going to kick me off, from Andy that I can see on the link text question. The best practice is for the links to have enough text to distinguish what the link does just by its text. In screen readers, you can scan the page just by links, but it only shows the specific text of the link. So if they say learn more or click here, it's unnavigatable. Thank you, Andy, for clarifying it better than I ever could.
Well, thanks very much, Jenny.
No problem. Thank you for dealing with
Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
And for other people, I see there's 2 other questions. Do just shout me, and I'm happy to talk once it's there as well.